54 countries in Africa. But how many can be described as democratic? There have been a number of elections this year, but also protests, violence, and leaders changing the law to stay in power. So, how do you define democracy in Africa? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. At least 16 African nations have held elections this year, but there have been almost as many debates as to whether democracy is actually disappearing across the continent. A number of leaders continue to hold an iron grip on power. Many are accused of repressing the opposition and amending laws to extend their rule. On Sunday, the people of Central African Republic turned out in large numbers for a vote seen as a crucial test in a country that suffered years of instability. There were reports of armed groups shooting in the air to intimidate voters in one central town, but the United Nations said the process was largely peaceful. President Faustin Archange Touadéra is seeking a second term, but he's been accused of vote rigging.
I am here to vote for peace. I have heard about problems in other parts of the country, but I had to do my bit.
I was born in this country, but I feel I have been marginalized as a Muslim. What's the point of voting again?
On the same day, about 7.5 million people cast their ballots in the Sahel state of Niger, in an election that could lead to the country's first peaceful transfer of power between two democratically elected presidents. President Mahamadou Issoufou is stepping down after reaching the limit of 2 5-year terms. Pulling off a peaceful poll will be seen as a success in a country blighted by poverty and one that's also fighting armed movements in the areas in the southwest and southeast.
We pray
to Allah to choose for us the president who has the most mercy for the people, a president who will not betray the country and who will not betray the trust of the people. That is our wish. It is also our wish that Allah may help to make the poor, the peasants, the breeders happy.
Earlier this month, Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo won a second term in a vote which has been overshadowed by post-election violence. At least 5 people have been killed. Former president and main opposition candidate John Mahama accused the incumbent of trying to rig the election. Ivory Coast President Alassane Ouattara pushed to change the constitution and run for a third term despite an opposition boycott. The election was marred by intimidation, violence, and electoral malpractice. Observers reported that 23% of polling stations did not open at all due to threats or attacks. In Guinea, Alpha Condé's decision to also run for a third term sparked protests that were met by a crackdown by security forces. Condé won almost 60% of the vote, but his opponents said the election was rigged and that Condé violated the constitution by running again. Dozens of people have since been killed in anti-government demonstrations. And in Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray, tensions escalated after leaders of Tigray's People Liberation Front held regional elections defying a federal government ban. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced a military offensive after accusing Tigrayan forces of attacking and seizing a military base in the regional capital, Mekelle, a charge they deny. The recent violence forced thousands of Ethiopians to escape into neighboring Sudan. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Pretoria, we have Somadoda Fikeni, Honorary Visiting Professor at the University of South Africa. Agnes Gitau is managing partner at advisory firm GBS Africa, where she focuses on political and economic risks associated with sub-Saharan Africa. She joins us from London. And also from the UK, in Luton, is Kwesi Aning, Director of the Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. He specializes in West Africa states and the Sahel region. Welcome to each of you. Somadoda, let me start with you today. From your vantage point, what is the state of democracy on the continent?
On the continent, I would simply say you do have a mixed picture. Some countries are showing stability, regular elections, but some countries are beginning to have their internal civil strifes, and at times the kind of tension that is threatening the very progress that has been made since the early 1990s. You are seeing violence in other instances. And what we think is beginning to happen and to be exposed is the fact that over-concentration on elections instead of looking at the fundamental, deep structural issues is not a sustainable way of deepening democracy, because you are beginning to see the underlying, deep structural, whether it's socio-economic issues, whether it's the struggle for resources, which sometimes is weaponized through regional identities, and also the struggling economies generally. All those, and corruption, of course, all those, even if you had a good democracy, it begin to have legitimacy crisis if it cannot deliver on the developmental issues and create equal opportunity and impactful development for all those who are part of that democracy.
Kwesi, earlier this year, Freedom House said that the region that showed the fastest decline in political rights and civil liberties in 2019 was West Africa, which had long been a driver of democratic gains. What are the reasons that democratic progress has backslid there?
Well, I think there are, multiple reasons, and I do agree very much so with the previous speaker. One is the resurgence of what I would term as duopolies, two strong political parties that over time have started to meddle in the way that institutions function, the judiciary, the media, even the legislature. But we are also seeing more autocratic forms of regimes in which, a certain lack of patience for inclusive politics, exclusive, policies in which young people primarily, and I think at a point in time, I hope we can come to the demographics, feel as if, they are not part of the debate. More disturbingly is the fanciful dressing around establishing institutions in which regimes are not actually interested in the independence, the resources, and the functioning of these institutions. So over time, the optimism and the hope of the 1990s about the resurgence of democratic institutions and democratic processes, plus a certain democratic dividend, are all beginning to go away, replaced by anger, frustration, increasing demonstrations, and a dissonance between an increasingly gerontocratic elite political class who don't understand the language of the youth. And it is this disconnect that I think we should begin to understand and to come to grips with. Otherwise, I think the next decade is going to be very difficult for the continent as a whole.
Agnes, I want to take a step back for a moment, shift from big picture and look more at one specific case study. The election in Tanzania in late October, it was marred by allegations of arrests of candidates, of arrests of protesters, restrictions on representatives of political parties having access to polling stations. Critics of President Magufuli accuse him of stifling dissent in his first 5 years in office. Election experts say that democracy is experiencing, really dire consequences there right now. How bad exactly is it in Tanzania?
We talk about democracy in Africa, and sometimes I wonder whether does it really work for the continent? Does the Western-style form of democracy work for our continent? And thank you for the question on Tanzania. Yes, Tanzania, one of a model economy, I would say, clearly in our part of East Africa, peaceful election over the years, really no chaos as evident in the rest of countries surrounding Tanzania. Yet just in October, what we saw was suddenly a move, people or countries ahead, sort of peaceful elections, peaceful transition from one government to the other. That is suddenly changing. And echoing what everybody else is saying is that I think the fundamental question is, does this really work? Are elections really the solution for the challenges the continent faces? Every speaker has spoken about the challenges of income inequality, poverty, rising youth unemployment, and when we hold these elections, election, the purpose and what our politicians tell us every day, every time they go out campaigning is we're going to provide, these very important needs that Africans need. So healthcare, education, infrastructure. But day in, day out, we are seeing sort of a backward movement from the 90s, where we saw democratic processes taking shape in the continent. I think Doha, we are getting tired, and really, I think a time has come for us to start questioning what works for us. Does it look? I work in a sector where we try to support investment into the region, and in the past, investors were very careful. They did not put their money where political stability wasn't visible. But now, as you've seen in Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, and investors are putting money. They don't care really about democratic processes. They don't care about peaceful elections. They care about returns. So, I think for us in Africa, we need to go back to the drawing board and see what works for us. How can we promote development, at the same time promote political stability? And then again, the fundamental question, is there an African, a democracy or a process that is informed by our values, without copying and pasting what has worked in Europe and thinking that is going to work for us?
Somadoda, are there heads of states in Africa that are positioning themselves as defenders of democratic governance and democratic norms right now? I mean, at a time when democracy is backsliding in a lot of countries, are there leaders that are on the stage there that are saying, no, we have to defend the democracies that we have fought so hard for?
Well, you do not have the same cohort of leaders that you saw in the 60s, where you had strong leadership and vision about the continent or their countries. What you are having now, it's mainly the 5-year term managerial presidents who do not have a vision beyond their stay in office, because they've professionalized politics. And most of the time, you do not have people or leaders who rally or make a clarion call. Of course, most of them do speak the language that is expected to be spoken, to say we are defending democracy, we want free and fair elections. But their actions and their pronouncements very often are at variance. It's more about politics of survival. It's more about politics of patronage and self-preservation, rather than a vision for the continent or for the countries they lead.
Kwesi, let me ask you about the elections in Niger that were held on Sunday, because there you saw, unlike other West African leaders, you saw President Issoufou. He didn't try to change the constitution and stay in power. He stepped aside at the end of his second term. How significant is that?
Well, I mean, on the surface and in the interim, it looks very significant. But I think the real test of that significance is whether the incoming government is able to transcend beyond the narrow confines of the managerial caretaker presidential politics that has been the bane of Niger and other African countries. That's number one. Number two relates to the extent to which this incoming government is capable of transforming the narrative and the discourses around those who are threatening with the force of arms the survival and stability of Niger. Now, hanging in the background will still be the military, a strong, intrusive, decisive force that the same politicians, as and when it fits their agendas, have called upon to come and do their dirty work for them. So when Somadoda talks about managerial presidencies, I think that is truly very generous of him. These are just caretaker ad hoc presidents driven by pecuniary self-interest and not understanding the broader shifting dynamics of these countries that they have been bequeathed with. And it is that disconnect, the rhetorical flourishes around democracies without deepening the structural underpinnings of these processes, that is leading to this sense of dismay, of anger, of frustration, and then the buy-in to the narratives of extremism and of violence. This is a West Africa-wide challenge. And of course, Isifu's decision not to continue, and he's been in power for quite some time, is encouraging. But I think we need to come around whoever is taking that power and to say things have changed. It cannot and must not be politics as usual. Otherwise, we will see the military coming back as in Mali.
Agnes, we've heard a lot this past year of crackdowns on dissent happening in various countries when it's time for elections to come around, when there's campaigning going on. How much were crackdowns on dissent on the rise in these various elections in 2020?
A lot of it we saw, particularly the fact that the Western government were very much focused on national issues, pandemic, issues of Brexit, Trump, politics. So what happens to a lot of African leaders, they took advantage of the fact that the West were no longer telling us what to do, or if they were, Africans were not really listening. So they took advantage of that. And because Africans, particularly led by the youth, realizing that we had nobody to look up to, they went to the street and started demanding accountability from their leaders. We saw, we saw Sudan. We saw, obviously, towards the end of this year, we saw Nigeria, and a lot of other places where we've seen young people, women, really going out and demanding accountability from government. But what a lot of these politicians have done is a crackdown, particularly on access to internet. Just cracking down on anybody who spoke against or who had different views. So we've seen a lot of that in various countries. But I think the hope for us is the fact that young Africans are really realizing that if anything is going to happen, if you're going to see the change, if you're going to see the kind of development and opportunities for everyone, I think it will come from Africa itself, and not really, as we have in the past, depended on the big donors from the West. But yes, certainly taking advantage of internet, of obviously issues, using terrorism. If you spoke against the government, we've seen activists being held on terrorism issues or their threat to security, just really using various excuses to try and crack down on anybody who was against their views or against their bad politics. But there is hope. The fact that young people are rising from one end of Africa to the rest and saying, look, enough is enough. And how can we, I think for us, is how can we manage that? And how can we move this activism that we're seeing among African young people and move that towards leadership and democracy ultimately.
Somadoda, by and large, how would you say citizens of many African countries view elections these days? Do they view it as a tool to build effective democratic institutions, or as a tool for those already in power to just stay in power?
There is a serious legitimacy crisis in our political class and the political system at large. That's why you find that smaller groups of people are participating, and the youth are very much dislocated from that particular process, precisely because demographic dividends that my colleagues have been talking about have not been forthcoming, particularly for the youth. Because when you talk of most of these economic challenges, social challenges, political challenges, challenges of employment, they mainly target the youth. Even when you talk of violent crime, corruption, or even diseases, they mainly afflict the youth. So there is a crisis there. Hence, there is a need to reimagine an African state by building a capacity of leadership, capacity of the state, as well as the capacity of citizens who, to some degree, must also look at options of self-reliance rather than dependence on the state.
Kwesi, for the countries that have held elections in 2020, how difficult has it been for the opposition in those countries to participate?
Well, let me focus on just a couple of them. I mean, Guinea, Mali, Ghana, La Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But probably before I start about the difficulties that the opposition has faced, let me respond to Agnes's great points about the crackdown. Look, the crackdowns in even these countries that I have mentioned have been consistent, they've been massive. But if you take Guinea and La Côte d'Ivoire, for example, although constitutions were meddled with and changed, and these presidents who ought not to have run for the elections eventually won, they have not been able to destroy and bend that spirit of optimism and resistance that we are seeing amongst the youth. End result, when their inaugurations have to take place, inaugurations in Africa, particularly after elections, have always been national celebrations of victory over the odds. In these two cases, the inaugurations were held within the presidential palaces. These gerontocrats, frightened of the masses out there saying, you cannot and we will not allow you to steal our vote. Now, closely related to this growing demand by the populace, particularly the youth and captured by opposition parties, has been the threats to changing laws about where it exists, party funding, access to media, the use of the military or the uniformed forces, the destruction of businesses, cutting off of internet, all kinds of dirty tricks have been used against the opposition. The end result is that although we are holding elections, and I think I like the points made by my colleagues, that probably we need to look at elections as the only conduit to deepening democracy. So we have election monitors, election observers who come in with a template that says, oh, well, but we've seen one opposition leader talking on the radio, talking on television. There's an opposition newspaper, and therefore the playing field is fairly level. That's not true. We are seeing opposition parties having to struggle for their very survival just to get a voice. Nevertheless, the little space that they have to send a message out, those messages have resonated across the continent and in all these countries. So though incumbent parties have consistently won, we are seeing opposition parties and voting patterns beginning to send a clear message that says, we will not accept politics as usual, in which a tiny elite, horribly corrupt, running a family and friends type of government, continue to loot their resources that must be used for the benefit of the generality of the populace. So I foresee a change coming. Gradual it is, and that change for me is crucial, and opposition politics even more crucial, because the alternative is much more violent social spread.
Kwesi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're starting to run out of time. We only have a little over a minute left, and I just want to try to get Agnes in here to give a last point. Agnes, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Kwesi was saying, so I wanted to see if you wanted to add anything, and also to see from your perspective if you felt that there were any bright spots out there, reasons for hope going forward.
Thank you, Joha. And Kwesi, you're absolutely right. I think elections, in my view, are unnecessary, they are expensive, and we spend a lot of money, holding elections, and which the outcome most people have disputed. So why should we have elections? Instead, why should we focus? And we know the challenges that the continent faces, challenges of infrastructure deficit, the healthcare system that has been disrupted by the pandemic. Why do we continue to do this election year after year? And what happens, we see death and destruction, economic instability. My view is we need to find a solution. And yes, there have been some bright spots, but that doesn't speak of the African continent. Seychelles, for example, and Cape Verde are few countries that have shown it can work, but there are about 55 countries in the continent. And clearly, we are in 2020, we see poverty year after year. We think democracy will resolve these challenges, yet It hasn't. So going forward, what works for the continent? It
Agnes?
really cannot be.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we have run out of time, so we're going to have to end the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Somadoda Fikeni, Agnes Gitau, and Kwesi Aning. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.